Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this fifth installment of Voting Matters, the capstone conference of Schlesinger Library's long 19th Amendment project, generously funded by a grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. The many colleagues here involved in the long 19th Amendment project have worked over the past 4 years to support new scholarship which sets the American woman's vote in a long temporal and a broad geographic arc, as well as within a richly intersectional analytic frame. Voting Matters showcases the diverse kinds of work we've sought to catalyze and to amplify. All of the conference's sessions have centered on historical moments, and so far we've explored the moment of origins for women's rights thinking and the vexed date of 1848, the post-Civil War amendments and the transformations of the American electorate that began around 1870, the achievement and the limitations of the 19th Amendment itself in 1920, and the transformation of American democracy with the Voting Rights Act and the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965. Today, as we continue to follow the long tail of the 19th Amendment in the year of its centennial and on the eve of a consequential election, we'll touch down through the work of 5 very different and very exciting discussants in the year 1982. So we should be playing a little Olivia Newton-John right now. Why 1982 in particular? As the 1982 unit in our open access suffrage syllabus explains, 2 landmark shifts in the shape of American citizenship happened that same year, and in fact, in the same month of June. A renewal and reinvigoration of the Voting Rights Act, and the expiration of a proposed constitutional amendment guaranteeing equal rights for women. Those twinned events remind us how much the landscape of voting was changing during the Reagan era. Our panelists will explore various facets of that landscape, literally from the ground up, as it were, and I'll introduce them each very briefly now. First to speak will be Moon Duchin, Associate Professor of Mathematics and Director of the Science, Technology, and Society program at Tufts University. Duchin is a leading expert on gerrymandering and electoral maps, an applied version of her work as a geometer. She'll invite us to think geographically as well as demographically when we talk about voting blocks. Next will be Timothy Stewart-Winter, Associate Professor of History, American Studies, and of Women's and Gender Studies at Rutgers, and a prolific author on the subjects of queer politics and urban politics, including the prize-winning book, Queer Clout, Chicago and the Rise of Gay Politics. Speaking third is Geraldo Cadava, Associate Professor of History at Northwestern and the author, most recently, of The Hispanic Republican, The Shaping of an American Political Identity from Nixon to Trump, which came out last May. You may also have seen his informative op-ed, Stop Othering Latino Voters, in the New York Times earlier this month. Then we'll hear from 2 panelists who explore facets of what we've come to call the gender gap in voting, something that both suffragists and anti-suffragists had predicted in the early 20th century, that women would vote as a bloc, but which didn't actually begin to manifest until the Reagan era. First, we'll hear from political strategist Olivia Perez-Cubas, Vice President of Bullpen Strategy Group and Communications Director of Winning for Women, a recently created super PAC devoted to electing Republican women. She'll talk about conservative women and Republican women and the ways that Winning for Women is trying to change the landscape of women's office holding. Finally, batting cleanup will be Professor Michelle Nickerson, Associate Professor of History at Loyola University Chicago and the author of Mothers of Conservatism, Women and the Post-War Right, which documents the grassroots activists of conservative women in Cold War Los Angeles. After each of these panelists makes some brief introductory remarks, my colleague Lisa McGurr, who is professor of history here at Harvard and the author, among many other books, of Suburban Warriors, The Origins of the New American Right, a foundational text in the new history of American conservatism, will moderate a discussion among the group and with the audience. We ask that you please use the Q&A feature on Zoom to submit questions that occur to you at any time during the program, and the speakers will address as many as they can. There are a lot of you on the call, and we anticipate a lot of questions, so please keep them short, which will increase the number of questions we can answer. And it's now my pleasure to pass the virtual floor over to Moon Duchin.
Hi, thank you so much. Okay, so let me start my screen share so that I can use some visuals to make some of the points that I'd like to make. So along the lines you just heard, I like to think about the spatiality of voting. And so I want to think about new blocks, new maps, new power with the frame of space. So to start, let's think about what a voting bloc might even mean for us in this conversation. So hopefully, I hope I grabbed Wikipedia's definition to get that conversation started. So the definition at least starts out very simple. It's a group of voters motivated by a specific common concern that tends to dominate their voting patterns, causing them to vote together in elections. So I want us to think about the question, who makes a bloc that matters, a bloc that registers. We can think about race, we can think about religion, we can think about sex, and we can think about issue alignment. But I'm also interested in the question, how does a bloc announce itself or make itself heard? What causes a bloc to have to be responded to by candidates and parties? And for that, I want to submit to you that spatiality matters. Let's take a quick look at what that might mean. So here's a juxtaposition I like to show of a recent election in Maryland and a recent election in Massachusetts. And I'd ask, if you're looking at them, these have the red-blue coloring that we're now familiar with, where red are more Republican outcomes and blue are more Democratic. I think to the eye, you might think that Maryland looks about maybe 2/3 Republican, or maybe half and half, depending on what you think about the population density, while Massachusetts looks all Democratic, blue Massachusetts. What's interesting is that this is actually a pair of elections that I chose to make the spatiality point. They actually have about the same overall preference. Both of these elections are about 1/3 Republican and 2/3 Democratic. So what makes them look so different is the question of kind of clustering or enclaves, distribution of the vote. So the point here that I'm trying to make is that when you have a non-spatial bloc, such as Republicans in Massachusetts, it's very dispersed, it's not spatially clustered, you can hear that bloc speak in the popular vote, but for districted elections, it's very hard for that bloc to show up. So to make that point, let's look at these pictures again. And now imagine that you are trying to cut these states up into districts, say congressional districts. It's pretty clear how you would give Republicans a voice in a congressional district, and you wouldn't be able to do it in Massachusetts. Actually, that's a provable fact for a whole census cycle worth of elections in Massachusetts. You literally cannot make a Republican favoring district just because of dispersal. Okay, so with that in mind, let's go to our moment in the 1980s and let's think about what's happening in the country. Well, one thing happening, of course, that I think you'll also hear some of my co-panelists talk about is a national realignment, particularly through the South, and what we might think of in the color scheme that I was just using as a reddening of the South. So we have a shift that starts in the 60s and is kind of moving quickly through the 80s, but I'm calling it a lagged reddening here, partly because I'm trying to make the point that districts are a level that intermediates in between preferences and outcomes, right? And in this case, they can have the effect of slowing a change. So districting really kind of intervenes on expression of a voting bloc, like this emerging Southern red bloc. But a second thing happens in the 80s that I want to use the rest of my time to at least point out, to bring up, which is the Voting Rights Act is transformed in more ways than one. So in 1982, we have a number of changes happening through Congress. But in 1986, the Supreme Court decides a case, Thornburg versus Jingles, which creates a really explicit role for racial voting blocs in the law. Okay, so what is this transformation? Now it's a kind of clarifying checklist that you have to use in voting rights litigation. Now you have to show that a minority that's going to use the Voting Rights Act is spatially distinct. So for the first time, this appears in the way voting rights cases are to go forward. They vote together as a bloc, and they are blocked by the majority, which is in effect an opposing bloc. So how do you show a thing like this? You do it spatially. So I'm showing you a diagram. This is an actual plot of the Rahm Emanuel Chuy Garcia mayoral runoff in Chicago in 2015. And every point in the plot is a precinct. What you see is that I organize the precincts by how Hispanic they are and by the share of their vote that went to Chuy Garcia. There's an obvious pattern here, and I can use that pattern to detect racial polarization. So this becomes the premier tool that's used in voting rights litigation. What before had been totality of the circumstances, maybe fuzzier, more holistic, now there's a pretty precise checklist that allows cases to go forward. So something I'd ask you to quickly notice at this point, this depends on spatial sorting. This only works because some precincts are a lot more heavily Hispanic than others. That's what lets you sort them into a plot like this. If you tried to do a similar plot for sex, for example, almost every precinct would be almost 50% women. And so this plot wouldn't work. It wouldn't let you extrapolate to the views of the group. Okay, so effects. The effects are really stark. So this is the moment we're talking about, this jingles moment in the 80s. Take a look at what's happening across the sort of sweep of post-Civil War history. You have Black representation, which, in Reconstruction, we have some Black representation in Congress, disappears in the Jim Crow era, ticks back up with the Voting Rights Act. But this is the moment that supercharges that for Black representation in the South. Post-jingles, these cases can go forward much more easily and effectively than they did before. Okay, so where does that leave us? Today, the Voting Rights Act is in danger, what you might call from above. There's a hostile Supreme Court atmosphere around the Voting Rights Act that causes voting rights advocates to be nervous. Also, there are new formations of minority groups which might in many cases be more spatially dispersed than African Americans were in the 60s, the era of the VRA's inception. So maybe dispersed minorities are going to need new remedies for the reasons that I've discussed. And so today we find ourselves in a position to think about what these new remedies might be. And they might be new districting practices, new inference practices, or they might be new election practices. This is a moment, for instance, when ranked choice is entering the conversation as a possibility for a way to tackle this problem. Okay, I'll stop there. And as I end my share, I'll turn the floor over to my brilliant friend, Tim Stewart-Winter, as our next speaker.
Hello. In 1982, Senator Walter Mondale of Minnesota was the keynote speaker at the first major fundraiser for the Human Rights Campaign Fund, which was a new gay rights political action committee. At the time, gay rights was not a cause that enjoyed popular support. And in fact, after the New York Times reported that Mondale would be appearing, the event's organizers briefly worried that he might cancel. But Mondale was seeking the Democratic Party's presidential nomination. And this appearance at a hotel ballroom in New York gave him a chance to appeal to an emerging and vocal constituency in the Democratic Party. In fact, gay and lesbian people had secured a plank in the party platform in 1980 in support of a federal law banning job discrimination based on sexual orientation. And Mondale's main rival for the presidential nomination, Ted Kennedy, was perceived as more liberal on so-called social issues. So speaking to an audience of about 1,000 gay and lesbian people gave Mondale an opportunity to sort of outflank Kennedy in pursuit of the gay vote. My topic today is the emergence of gay and lesbian people as an organized constituency in American electoral politics between the mid-70s and the mid-90s. And 1982 is a great moment to understand that process. And what I want to highlight most is that the gay vote, the emergence of the gay vote, was part of the broader process in which gender and sexuality became, for the first time, a major axis of partisan alignment. So in this period, feminists and gay rights activists gained clout within the Democratic Party at the same time that their opponents similarly rose to power in the Republican Party. So the context for all this is the women's liberation movement in the 70s inspired gay and lesbian people to kind of reconceptualize the personal as political. Disclosing one's homosexuality to other people became a political act in the 1970s, which is the decade when the Gay Pride Parade is invented and spreads to every big city in the US. At the same time, by the late 70s, there's this major counterforce that emerges in the form of a movement for traditional family values, which opposes women's increased access to abortion, the passage of local gay rights ordinances, and the movement of the Equal Rights Amendment toward ratification. In 1980, Catholics like Phyllis Schlafly, Protestants like Jerry Falwell, and others see their years of organizing pay off when Ronald Reagan, a divorced former movie actor, becomes the improbable vehicle of this quest for representing the cause of traditional family values. And Ronald Reagan was the last Republican to get 50% of women's votes for president, right? The 1980s is the moment when you see for the first time the gender gap between men and women in voting that has increased really ever since then. Another key moment in that polarization was 1992, when the Republican convention included a series of harsh denunciations of feminists, of gay equality, and Bill Clinton embraced gay people to some extent. He used the word gay in his convention speech. And 92 was also the first year that pollsters asked presidential voters in exit polls to say if they were lesbian, gay, or bisexual. And those who did voted overwhelmingly for Democrats. So I want to just run through a couple of other things that happened in 1982 to kind of spotlight other aspects of this change. In March, Wisconsin became the first state to enact a law prohibiting job discrimination based on sexual orientation. In April, Congressman Henry Waxman of California held the first congressional hearings about a mysterious new disease affecting gay men. In October, Jerry Falwell announced that his organization, Moral Majority, which had registered 4 million new voters in 1980, planned to register another 4 million by 1984. And in December, the San Francisco Board of Supervisors passed health insurance and bereavement leave for the same-sex partners of gay city employees, although Dianne Feinstein, the mayor, vetoed that bill. Now, what do these examples show? 3 key things. First of all, the gay vote emerged first in big city municipal politics, and we really have to understand local politics at the local level to grasp it. Even though there was no federal statute protecting gay people until 2009, every US city and a number of states enacted those measures in the 70s and 80s. Second, even Democrats were reluctant to embrace gay rights. Mondale, in his 1982 speech, didn't say the word gay or lesbian or homosexual. And the backlash in the late 1970s, embodied by Anita Bryant, was mirrored on the national level when both Bill Clinton and George W. Bush embraced new anti-gay legislation while they were running for re-election. And there were also state-level backlashes. The third thing I want to highlight is that the AIDS crisis led gay Americans to articulate new demands on the regulatory state, including the Ryan White Care Act in 1990, crucial change to the political landscape. And finally, I want to say voting is never the only thing we need to look at to understand the trajectory of sexual politics. So 1982 is the year that Mondale speaks to a gay audience, but it's also the year that the Federalist Society is founded. And the same week that Mondale spoke, Ronald Reagan placed on the powerful DC circuit the advisor to one of the Federalist Society's founding chapters, Antonin Scalia, who of course affected American law for decades to come. It is now my pleasure to pass the virtual floor to Geraldo Cadava.
Thank you so much, Tim, and thank you everyone for participating in this. And I'm already excited by all of the points of overlap in our presentation. I'm just really happy to be here. So generally, I'm going to be talking about the Latino vote over the past 50 years. And this is the period when Americans have paid attention to something called the Latino vote. So in my 6 or 7 minutes, I'll speak in very general terms, and hopefully we can dig into this a little more during the Q&A. I'm going to focus on 2 issues related to the Latino vote. The first is the 1975 extension of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And the second is the continued low rates of electoral participation by Latinos, despite the removal of structural barriers to their voting. First, I want to give you just a little bit of context which can help you understand why political parties and Americans in general started paying attention to the Latino vote when they did. And the first thing I want to point out is the shifting politics, the electoral politics of the United States as a result of the growth of the Sun Belt. So in 1950, New York was still the state with the greatest number of electoral votes. But by 1960, that had started to shift toward the Sun Belt from Florida to California. And these are states where there was a higher concentration of Latinos in these places. At the same time, Latinos were demanding greater political inclusion because of their service in World War II, increasing rates of education, demands of the civil rights movement. So all of this led to a growing attention to the Latino vote. Famously, in 1978, Time magazine published a cover story saying that the 1980s will be the decade of the Hispanic. What they meant by this was the growing population of Latinos, their rising participation in politics, and their growing inclusion because of the civil rights movement would have a significant impact on American politics in the 1980s and beyond. So it's also the moment in 1978 where the first Hispanic declares himself a candidate for president as a Republican. His name is Benjamin Boxcar Ben Fernandez. And all of this was playing out in the context of congressional debates about the Voting Rights Act from 1965 forward. The Voting Rights Act got extended several times in 1970, 1975, 1982, the year that's critical for our panel, and then again in 1992. And just very basically, the idea is that the 1965 Voting Rights Act largely addressed the barriers to African American voting in the South, but didn't apply to Latinos. In 1970, the extension 5 years later didn't do much either. It addressed the jurisdictions that had used a literacy test and also where less than 50% of the voters were eligible voters were registered as of the 1968 election. So that did extend the Voting Rights Act to a couple of counties with a lot of Latinos. So Apache County, Arizona, Imperial County, California, and Kings and New York County in New York. But the real momentous change for Latinos came in 1975 with the extension of the Voting Rights Act in that year. And what the 1975 extension did during the Ford administration was it extended the Voting Rights Act to apply to specific language minorities. And that included Spanish speakers, Asian language speakers, indigenous language speakers, so hardly just Latinos. And it said that if more than 5% of voting age citizens were of a single minority group in a particular place, then election materials would be published in that language. It also established the idea of pre-clearance for these groups and federal observer protections. And pre-clearance is just when the Department of Justice has to approve any changes to local voting laws before they could take effect. The hearings in 1975 focused on Texas in particular, and also the idea that Latinos had experienced troubles that were similar to what African Americans faced before 1965. And several prominent Hispanic advocates gave testimony. So Vilma Martinez, for example, the head of the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, or MALDEF, talked a lot about the pattern of abuse in Texas and things like the refusal to place registered Mexican American voters on voter lists, or election judges who deliberately invalidated ballots, or the refusal of aid to minority voters in English, and gerrymandering, and other techniques and tools that excluded or diluted Mexican American participation. Another person testifying was Edward Roybal, a Democrat from California, and he talked about rural Mexican Americans in California who experienced voter intimidation when they were trying to register. And another was Leonel Castillo, who was the controller of the city of Houston, who talked about the continuation of a poll tax and how many Mexican Americans had to register every year, sometimes 9 to 11 months before the next general election. These are the kinds of issues that were highlighted in 1975 and which led to the extension of the Voting Rights Act. And then in 1982, 1992, there were several tweaks, but by and large, each of these times the Voting Rights Act was considered, it led to an expansion of the original scope of the law to further protect minorities. It led to the extension of pre-clearances to the Southwest, Florida, and New York, the establishment of bilingual education materials, the development of results tests for violations against Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which helped determine whether there were discriminatory effects or intent. And now to transition, what I want to point out is that the 1975 extension and all of its subsequent extensions worked to solve structural problems, but it hasn't solved the issue of participation. Latinos still vote at low rates. And this is related to our conversation about power, and the real power in many ways among Latino voters is with non-voters more than voters. The old explanation for why Latinos didn't vote had to do with apathy, that they didn't care about American politics. But more recent explanations have focused on alienation from the political process, that Latinos don't feel included in American politics. They feel like electoral politics wasn't designed for them because their problems have rarely been solved by elected officials. And I think that this is largely because both parties haven't taken Latinos seriously as political actors with sincere and deeply held beliefs. Instead, they've continued to think of Latinos as members of a voting bloc, as natural Republicans or natural Democrats. And I think too many campaigns still don't talk to Latinos until very late in election cycles. There were reports this summer that more than half of Latinos reported that they hadn't been contacted by either campaign. And whether or not campaigns take Latinos seriously has to do with whether or not a particular candidate has a personal connection to Latino communities, or whether or not they decide early on that Latinos would be a priority for them. So they engaged early, established a continuous presence, even when not looking for votes. And I think the result of all this is that Latinos today are hyper visible in some places, all of the traditional battlegrounds that we know about, Florida and Arizona, increasingly Texas, but we're less seen in other places like Maine or Wisconsin or Pennsylvania or Michigan or in Minnesota, even though these were the states with the narrowest margins of victory in 2016. And in every single one of them, there was a greater number of eligible Latino voters than the margin of victory. So I think all of this calls for a rethinking of how politicians and campaigns talk to and about Latinos. So right now, I just wanted to draw your attention to the kind of solution to some of the structural issues faced by Latinos through the extensions of the Voting Rights Act, but how that hasn't necessarily translated to increased political participation. And with that, I will turn it over to Olivia Perez-Cubas. Thank you.
Thank you, Geraldo. And thank you to the Radcliffe Institute for inviting me here today and to speak with you all. I am very excited to be joining you. My name is Olivia Perez-Cubas. I am the communications director and spokesperson for a fairly new organization called Winning for Women, which is a nonprofit that's dedicated to helping to advance and empower center-right women leaders. It has a connected federal PAC that allows us to give critical hard dollar support to women candidates. But I would like to focus the bulk of my remarks on a fairly even newer effort that we launched called Winning for Women Action Fund. And Winning for Women Action Fund is actually the first Republican super PAC dedicated solely to electing women. And when I say that, some people are surprised that it is just the first. However, I say better late than never. And we really launched this effort following the 2018 midterm elections when we saw the number of Republican women in the US House of Representatives slashed to just 13, which obviously in no way is a reflection of reality or the country, nor of the Republican Party. And we asked ourselves, why is this the case? Why is this happening? Because we've seen that there's no shortage of qualified Republican women, but how do we ensure that they have a chance of getting on the playing field and then succeeding once there? So one of the biggest things that we found that was missing within kind of the political ecosystem on the right was a concerted effort to elect more women. And we kind of addressed it twofold. The first being taking a page out of the left's playbook in terms of their efforts, which have been incredibly successful to recruit and elect women. And also we looked at it through the lens of the challenge that primary elections, that Republican women, the challenge that they face getting out of their primary. So we've seen the success of groups on the left in large part to Emily's List, which I'm sure everyone is familiar with. But the left has done a really good job of kind of tapping into all corners of the party to recruit and support female candidates from start to finish. And the truth of the matter is that the left has been far outpacing the right on this front for decades. And we are very much playing a game of catch up. And we really, like I mentioned, needed to take a page out of their playbook in terms of outreach, recruitment, support, and ultimately electing more women. But because of the success of these groups, women on the left often have access to more resources. So there really needed to be a counterweight to groups like Emily's List so that Republican women could go toe-to-toe with their peers on the left. And not to state the obvious, but groups like Emily's List obviously didn't see success overnight. We still have a long way to go, but I do think that the mere existence and creation of this super PAC is important, but also has been able to accomplish a lot in a short amount of time. So we're taking big strides in the right direction. And kind of that second bucket that I mentioned earlier is primary elections are a big challenge for Republican women. For various reasons, both party committees, both on the right and the left, stay out of primaries. They don't engage in primary races. But we identify that if primaries are one of the biggest impediments to seeing more Republican women in Congress, well then someone's got to step up and do something about it. So we kind of raised our hand on that front and expressed a willingness to play early on in a candidate's primary election. And we really, so the first example of that was actually a special election last summer in North Carolina 3, where we went and we supported a female candidate down there who's really dynamic, great candidate, would have been a really good fit for her district. And we put in about $1 million on her behalf. We were able to get her out of the primary and into a runoff. We were not ultimately successful, but we would do it again. And twofold, we learned a lot of lessons. We're a new organization. This is the first time that a super PAC solely dedicated to women is playing in such a big way. That was an important signal to send to the party. But also, one of the biggest and most rewarding things that we saw following that North Carolina election was a surge in women across the country who reached out to us, particularly via our website, who were interested in what we were doing, who were curious about it, and more importantly, interested in running for office. So we learned a lot of lessons. The value of playing in primaries. We've played in a few races this cycle as well, and we are seeing gains because of it. We, have a long way to go, but 2020 has actually been a record year for Republican women. We have more Republican women than ever before who are running for office, over 200, and more Republican women than ever before who have won their primary elections, which is over 90 and about half of the previous record set, which was back in 2004. So again, a long way to go, but significant strides, significant gains that have been made. And really, our view of it is that the long-term survival of the Republican Party and the conservative movement is incumbent upon more diversity within the party, is incumbent upon broadening our tent. I think we've seen calls to see more women in office, particularly on the Republican side, since we had steps to take to, accurately reflect our country. But we've seen calls to have more women in office rise, particularly from the younger generation that is going to continue to define the country and the party. And that is a conversation that we want to be a part of. It's a conversation that we want to help shape. We're proud of the work we do and look forward to kind of continuing to make gains in future cycles. So with that, I will pass the virtual microphone to Michelle Nickerson.
Thank you, Olivia. And thank you to the Radcliffe Institute. Good afternoon, everyone. So I have actually been pretty busy over the last month phone banking for the Sister District Voter Volunteer Project. And while doing so and thinking about this panel, it occurs to me that voter blocks are as much processes as they are things. Blocks do not technically exist until they move people from point A to point B, from their homes to the polls. So I want to talk to you especially about mobilization. But before that, I'm just going to back up a little bit here. There might not be a monolithic female voting bloc, as Jane Kamensky mentioned at the beginning of the panel, but there is a long established pattern of female political activism around elections and around policy across the political spectrum. Historians have rightly pointed out that once enfranchised, women have tended to vote along other alignments that were meaningful to them, like their families, religious affiliation, etc. And as other sessions of Voting Matters, the symposium, have already discussed, women were not uniformly enfranchised by the 19th Amendment, since Jim Crow voting restrictions suppressed the votes of non-white, mostly African-American women in the United States. Rather than gender blocks, we see, of course, gender gaps, which vary historically from election to election and within racial and ethnic groups, as well as levels of education, etc. What the second battle over the Equal Rights Amendment showed us at the end of the 70s and early 80s, instead, is the importance of women to activism and mobilization, that movement I mentioned from A to B. When the ERA failed to ratify in 1982, it was not because of the effort behind it petering out. Part of the struggle for proponents was the potential impact of the ERA, which seemed unclear, as several other historians have pointed out. This then gave opponents the opportunity to raise alarm about unisex bathrooms, daughters drafted to the front lines, and other nightmare scenarios. Opponents most notably represented by Phyllis Schlafly's Stop ERA campaign. They succeeded in raising enough doubt about women's interest in the amendment, enough to push legislators to distance themselves from the measure. For many early 80s observers, Schlafly and her conservative cohorts seemed to come out of nowhere. You might be familiar with that expression, backlash. But plenty of scholars, from Dr. McGurr to Elizabeth Gillespie McCrae and I and others have documented the grassroots female activist tradition on the right from which Schlafly emerged, and it dates back to the early 20th century. This brings me to the second point I'd like to make. We also see how gender has shaped the conservative electorate in terms of how people see their own importance as voters. So with that, I'm pivoting now to a discussion of political consciousness formation. We know, for example, that after party affiliation, there are other ways in which voters identify, such as conservative, taxpayer, homeowner, union member. These have all been ways to motivate people to get to the polls. Now, on the surface, this way of understanding one's role in politics might seem gender neutral, but it doesn't take really much digging to see how gender shapes the way that people understand themselves as part of these communities. So let's take one example that has been getting a lot of attention in the current moment, the suburban housewife. When I wrote Mothers of Conservatism, I mistakenly thought that I was writing about a historical category, one that we demonstrated, I and my colleagues, to be politically important in the 20th century. But here we are in 2016, and the president can't stop himself from talking or tweeting about suburban housewives. Just to be clear, I have little faith that suburban housewives as a bloc will swing this election. And as I wrote in a recent Washington Post column, however, this category is still relevant because it operates in the Republican imagination in a way I want to talk about. Just as Phyllis Schlafly and her teams of volunteers convinced legislators to stick up for the protections that preserved the male bread-winning role for them, Donald Trump imagines himself saving women in the suburbs from the activists and rioters who are supposedly threatening to bring disorder across city lines. But we know that while we might see something of a wave of women coming from the suburbs to vote in November, they won't be uniformly Republican. And this is what brings us back to the time of the 19th Amendment. The housewife of today's Republican imagination is an updated incarnation of the white women in the Jim Crow imagination, a symbol of feminine vulnerability threatened by dark-skinned aggressors. The president and other GOP strategists are hoping that this imagined vulnerability will turn Republicans out to vote in support of local police, ICE raids, the border wall, the Muslim ban, and attacks on China for releasing the so-called Wuhan flu. It is why Ronna McDaniel, the RNC chairwoman, introduced herself at the convention as a housewife, leaving viewers to imagine her leading the entire GOP from her kitchen table to save nuclear, heteronormative Christian families from the radical Joe Biden. I am eager to see how effective this fantasy of a colorblind voting bloc plays out in a couple weeks. I suspect that the suburban woman voter with her American dream will go the way of the soccer mom, that is, in the annals of past elections. But we will, for sure, see a future carnation of the unsafe white lady trope in future cycles as well. Thank you very much. And with that, I'd like to turn the panel over to Professor Lisa McGurr.
Thank you for turning it over, and thank you all for these really quite very stimulating presentations, and they have such fascinating synergies and overlaps. And I guess in that spirit, I had a question for all of you, which is essentially, you each talk about very different blocks, obviously. Women, gay folks, Hispanics. And I just wanted to ask, what is it that there's suddenly a kind of turn to working for political empowerment through the voting process, through political parties? What is it about this moment? Is it a shift in the party structures? Is it political polarization? What is it about the 80s that you see this kind of emergence, even discussion of blocks What's going on writ large in the political process that you see is contributing to all of these different groups emerging as new actors in this process? And that's for anyone who would like to take a stab at it.
I'm happy to start us off.
Sure.
And I'm eager to hear what other people have to say. Just briefly, first of all, I want to point out the move in political electioneering over this time towards kind of the mail, meaning like the postal mail system through which campaigns could mobilize voters in ways that actually women volunteers had done in past decades. But now it became a business of kind of mass mailing campaigns that made it even easier and important to identify voting blocks to be targeted by campaigns. So in a sense, it became more professionalized. Secondly, I would mention identity politics that come out of the 1960s and 1970s, where people come to see themselves within these categories that we've been talking about. And the third point I would make would be the culture wars, where in addition to politics, people are seeing themselves in opposition to other groups or blocks that are making themselves visible on the political spectrum, or excuse me, political landscape.
I would just add to that when we talk about identity politics and people coming to see themselves as groups, the one precise example of the Jingles decision also is a legal inscription of those groups as discrete and separated. You have to treat them that way in order to bring these cases forward. So there's this way, that identity politics isn't just happening in a bottom-up way, but there's this top-down identity politics that comes in through the Jingles factors.
I would cite the role of Black political empowerment after 1965 in the sense that some of the tools that African Americans use to gain power in big city politics, like voter registration in particular, are then picked up, among other things, by gay activists wanting to sort of enter that power structure that's been broken open in the 70s.
I could just add one thing myself too. I think that all of what you're saying is right in the case of Latinos too. I think it has to do with identity politics. I think it has to do with political empowerment following the civil rights era. But the interesting wrinkle, I think, at least when it comes to Latinos and how the Republican Party reaches out to Latinos, I don't know if this idea applies to other groups as well, is that, one of Reagan's innovations when it came to Latino outreach was to move away from like Nixon era patronage politics, where he was creating programs for specific groups, and he wanted to make outreach much more ideology based. And it was actually Reagan's Hispanic campaign advisors who tried to articulate what the ideological issues were that would bring Latinos into the Republican Party. So like work ethic, family values, patriotism, anti-communism. And the Republican Party has kind of stuck with those ideological issues really since the 1980s as a way of bringing different groups of Latinos together. So, blocks are happening in the 1980s, but at least in terms of what Reagan says, he wants to move away from thinking about blocks and towards American ideologies, something like that. So both are happening at the same time.
So that is fabulous. And I also love the point about both it happening from the bottom up, but also top down, right? Those who are calling for enfranchisement identity politics, but also the political parties themselves. But I guess in that spirit as well, I would like to ask, relatively to both your political groups, but more broadly in terms of American democracy, how do you see and come to terms with the idea of blocks? Are they would you argue they're good for American democracy, bad for American democracy? Are there certain kind of limits they set? What's the sort of, how do we want to think about these? Or is it just a natural part of the way, groups gain power in politics? What do you guys think of that?
Laura?
Well, one thing I'd say about that is when you think about kind of districted elections, which I like to do, there's this a bloc has to kind of become talked about, has to make itself spatially visible, and then candidates and parties have to respond to that bloc. So there are these kind of stages that have to happen. A bloc can only exercise itself when its concerns are spoken to by the candidates and parties available. If we think about voting as expression in that way. So if you think, for instance, about economic and class-driven issues, you'd have to have kind of party alignment that speaks to those issues before the bloc can have a voice. That's one of the things I really love to think about, and that's why I kind of teased the possible future impact of less spatially mediated forms of arrangement being a way to kind of empower blocs more directly to be reflected in representation. When you use districted two-party elections, there are all these intervening steps along the way. It's just an observation about bloc formation.
If I could just jump on there, and I'll try to hold myself back from going on a rant because I'm pretty anti-bloc these days, I think. But I'm sure there are good reasons for blocs and how they enable political empowerment, but I also think they can do as much harm as good. So I liked what Moon said about it. Kind of depends on how politicians try to reach that bloc and speak to that bloc. And that's really important because I don't know if the blocs are so much the problem itself as how politicians think about and talk to the bloc. So the bloc that I'm like ranting against right now is like the dairy farmers of Wisconsin. And I have nothing against dairy farmers, but I feel like candidates can't go 5 minutes without tripping all over themselves about the dairy farmers of Wisconsin. And there are 8,000 dairy farms in Wisconsin. They employ full-time 215,000 full-time workers. And meanwhile, there are 379,000 Latino voters in Wisconsin, but you don't hear about the Latino voters of Wisconsin, or you don't hear about the fact that many of the dairy farmers are lecheros, they're Latino dairy farmers. So, I think so maybe it's just a problem of how politicians think about the blocs. That's the issue, but okay, I said I was gonna hold back from going on a full rant. I just went on half a rant.
One cost
Go ahead, Timothy. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. I think a cost of blocs in the case of gay and lesbian and now LGBTQ voters is that the voters who are most likely to identify politically with that cause primarily are white, cisgender gay men, right? And so it has it sort of exacerbates the marginalization of queer people of color to have a bloc constructed based on being gay or being queer.
So that is, sorry, Moon, do you want to add something? Go ahead.
I just wanted to say how all of these last few comments fit together really beautifully. Bloc talk is stereotyping. Sometimes it's really helpful, constructive stereotyping because it coalesces an identity into, a voice. But bloc talk is fundamentally, as Geraldo's point makes clear, it's fundamentally about sort of imbuing, say, dairy farmers of Wisconsin with some kind of symbolic force, right? And we should just be aware of how talking that way can be strategic and can also be really limiting.
Absolutely, that's great. I mean, we've got a whole bunch of different blocs that we've been talking about, but I guess since this is about the 19th Amendment and about women, let's talk a little bit more, teasing out to the extent to which when we talk about women as a bloc, can we talk about women as a bloc? Which women, how do we want to think about that? And I guess that's more directed to, Michelle and Olivia.
I'll just jump in quickly in terms of the irony of being a women's group for a party that eschews identity politics, right? So how do you navigate that? How do you get around that? And kind of to Geraldo's point, speaking to the ideology, speaking to the candidate's experience or background and their qualifications, but also framing it in terms of, well, A, we need more women simply some people, right, the sake of electoral success, right, we're going to keep losing elections if we are not doing a better job of electing more women and appealing to more women. But also that is not identity politics, that we need to have a Congress that reflects the country, that reflects the party, that reflects the broad spectrum of Americans, and make sure that we are doing a better job of appealing to as many people as possible, broadening the tent. And the first step, obviously, that we believe to that is making sure that we are speaking and electing more women.
I think Olivia made a really good point, and so I don't feel like I have to say a whole lot more. Just that in terms of past elections, I don't think that, of course, there's no way to put women together in a voting bloc in terms of how they're going to, vote one particular way for a candidate. And so what I find that women have kind of in common has less to do with the ways that they vote than in their kind of political behaviors and what they do to kind of make things happen, to kind of rally voters for their particular candidates and work with each other.
Great. Okay. I did have one more. We're going to turn soon to the Q&A from the audience, but just one more follow-up for Olivia. It's also kind of linked to one audience question, but the failure of the decline in the Republican Party of women who are actually in office. Maybe you can talk a little bit about how you see that decline, what some of the causes are, whether it's about the certain kinds of politics and shifts within the Republican Party that are leading down a path that women feel less part of that, wanting to be part of that party and political process. Just respond to that.
Yeah, I think there are elements of all the above. I touched on this briefly in my comments, but I do think the creation of groups on the left, like Emily's List, which have had enormous amounts of success because they really made concerted efforts to recruit women and then support them through the process, and kind of how the right lacked those mechanisms, and how we really had a lot of ground to make up for, which became abundantly clear after the 2018 midterm elections. And just the mere existence of groups like Winning for Women and our Super PAC, but also to see and hear more Republicans talking about the problem and proactively doing something about it. Because I feel like after every election, there's always the kind of analysis where we need to do a better job with women particularly, but nothing really gets done. And I do think the cycle that's changing, again, success doesn't happen overnight, but important strides that are being made, and really just making sure that within the political ecosystem on the right, that there are concerted efforts to elect more women and to be able to talk about it.
Thank you.
Can I just add something briefly to that?
Yeah.
I'm wondering, when we, a little bit in the future, and we look back to this, I'm wondering what we're going to find is over the past, let's say 15 years, that women have actually gotten more involved in politics on the right in the Republican Party. I'm thinking about the leading role that women played in the Tea Party movement, for example, but that in 2016 especially, there was a misogynist turn at the top of the party. And there was a hostility towards women in office that made it difficult for the candidates that Olivia and her organization to promote, maybe made it difficult to get attention. But I mean, I think it's going to take some time before we can really properly evaluate that.
That's great. Thank you so much. We're now actually going to turn to some questions from the audience. I would ask audience members to submit your questions through the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please keep your questions short and concise, because we want to try to get through as many as we can in the brief time that we have before you. So I have one question about Right, about key issues, to what you see as a key issue that galvanizes your bloc. And that's a question for everybody. So what is a core issue within kind of that sort of galvanizing folks to mobilize around a bloc, either now or in 1982?
So I'll just mention, like, if we're talking about women, I see two different issues. For women on the right, abortion, just like with so many other conservatives, but abortion has been, such the single issue campaign. And I think it has a lot to do with what's happening right now with the Supreme Court nomination. And then in the Democratic Party, it's misogyny and sexism and, going back to Me Too and the Women's March, I think has really galvanized women to get out and basically vote the president out of office.
Great. Okay, others?
I would say healthcare. The Affordable Care Act had built into it a bunch of things that were good both for gay and lesbian people and for trans people and people living with HIV and AIDS. And so in that sense, and that was true in 82 as well. I think there's the Democrats have Biden has focused on an issue that certainly resonates with this bloc to the extent that there is one.
I can say something that's not especially original. I'm just reporting on attitude surveys and opinion surveys and their results. And so for Latinos, we regularly refer to the economy, healthcare, education, and then immigration and border control. And I think on all of those issues, there are liberal and conservative positions. I think with education, for example, charter schools are a really important issue for Latino Republicans, and a third of charter school students in the United States are Latino. When it comes to, well, I don't need to go through all the issues. I think the common mistake, I think, is that immigration and the border are the issues that Latinos care about primarily. I think in some ways those two issues are, besides their impact on immigrants and border communities, they are kind of symbolic of how Latinos feel included or excluded in the country. So again, healthcare, education, the economy, and immigration and border control, I think, are the key issues.
Great. So thank you for that. That's really great to hear. I also had a question from an audience member which is specifically sort of to Tim, but it speaks to a larger issue about the importance of voting versus other strategies for empowerment among the groups that you are concerned with. So Tim, we have an audience member who's asking that he would like to hear thoughts on gay pride parades as a highly successful type of protest and empowerment movement, helpful in providing attention, setting the agenda, and creating attitudinal shifts. I guess given what he's asking there, which is about the intersection of that with the vote, I was going to take that question in a direction for all of you, which is the extent to which the vote itself, which is obviously the topic at hand, but to what extent that we should focus on that for an empowerment of the particular groups that you guys are concerned with, or to what extent is it kind of misplaced and buying into kind of identifying that blocks and kind of, in a way, demobilize groups that simply vote as a strategy for political power. So if you could pick up on that question. Tim, I'll start with you since the audience.
I think I actually missed a piece of the question, the first part.
Thoughts about the gay pride parades and the way they served as a successful movement for protest,
Parades.
And agenda setting, attention getting, and creating attitudinal shifts, which were really successful strategies for gay rights. And then I'm turning
Right.
then that as versus looking at blocks and political parties.
Right. I mean, a lot of the initial targets of the gay movement in the 1970s were, not the political structure, right? Like psychiatrists, maybe above all. And I think combating invisibility, right? This is a minority that doesn't, it's not an identity that's passed on from parents to children. Most often it's, so this struggle for visibility is not the same as the struggle for representation politically. And I think, the AIDS crisis kind of merged the two in the sense that the 1987 March on Washington became, which was the biggest march on Washington since '63, became both. And so I think there are moments where the two strategies have worked well together, and there are moments when that's less the case. I think visibility is this distinctively significant problem for LGBTQ politics, and also candidates, right? I mean, the first openly gay politicians were people who were outed, and that continues to be a problem or a dynamic in queer politics that's distinctive.
I have a thought to add to that, which is, I was thinking about the Pride Parade as a mechanism for announcing yourself as a bloc. Another example that I actually learned about from Tim earlier is in urban politics, voter registration drives themselves could be very effective in terms of a bloc announcing its voting power. And so there are examples in Chicago history where a voter registration drive that's big enough to produce numbers that would matter for alderman campaigns kind of forces that step that I keep talking about, where the parties and in some cases candidates have to respond to the issues. So voter registration itself can be a way of kind of flexing, if not bloc status, at least sort of group status to which the candidates and the parties have to be responsive. So I think that's, I think a lot of folks these days are thinking about mechanisms of voter access and of voter suppression and how those interact with some of these other factors that we're describing. But partly they can be, particularly through voter registration, they can be ways of flexing, of announcing yourself as a group that matters.
Great, thank you. Okay, so another audience question. We have Myra Ferre, who's asking, Olivia, what is the status of the Republican Party wish list, women in both the House and the Senate? So what's the sort of, I guess, goals is that would be for the wish list?
Yeah, so I mean, we've made really good gains, which hopefully easy to do when you're starting at such a low number. But we've made really good gains this cycle in terms of the number of women who have run for office, the number of women who have been in the primaries and are now on the ballot come November. I think, the ultimate goal of winning for women is that we don't really need to exist because there's parity. So until you get that, you're certainly striving for more. But I think that it is important to acknowledge that both the creation of groups like ours and the success we've seen, as well as the party support that we've seen from leadership, but importantly, Republican men and women. We need the support of Republican men to help. We've seen gains, long way to go, but we're getting there.
Great, thank you. Okay, so let's see. I have a question then we were talking about identity politics and sort of the mobilization of identities in politics. How are those identities formed? Somebody's asking a question for Jerry about the role of sort of media and Spanish language media, Telemundo and Univision, constructing a kind of, I guess, block or sense of identity among different Latino ethnic identities. And if you have anything to say about that, providing sort of voter education and civic identity among Spanish-speaking citizens.
Yeah, no doubt, Telemundo and Univision have been critically important to the formation of Latino self-conception, political identity, cultural identity. I remember reading a profile of Jorge Ramos in The New Yorker several years ago, and one of my favorite details is how he self-consciously developed a kind of generic pan-Latino accent instead of a kind of specific national group accent like Cuban or Puerto Rican or Mexican American, but the point was to appeal to all Hispanics. So it was critical. And other things, other media are too. I mean, Spanish language radio stations, in particular, DJs like El Piolín, is really important. And if you want to read more about this, there's a book by Cristina Mora, a sociologist, called Making Hispanics, and Univision and Telemundo that's one of her case studies, one of her chapters. The others are the census, Richard Nixon's Cabinet Committee on Opportunities for Spanish-Speaking People. These are all examples of how this category of Hispanic was created. Thank you.
Super. Okay, so we have time, unfortunately, only for one last question before we need to close out this session. And I will, again, in line with the 19th Amendment, ask about women. And that is for both, again, for Michelle and Olivia, the extent to which, when we talk about blocs, to what extent is it, Michelle, you mentioned before that women didn't really vote, you know, as folks thought after 1920 in a kind of group and a bloc, but do women today, or more recently, women voters elect actually women candidates? Is there a way that there's a kind of link there or not?
So that's a good question, and I can't answer directly about correlations between women voters blocs and you know, the actual election of women candidates. But I can just remind our listeners about the multiplicity of organizations that are formed and staffed by women and include mostly women to actually get women candidates on the ballot and into office. You know, we've talked about Emily's List. Sister District, which is the one I'm working with now, it's not a women's organization. It just happens to support a lot of women candidates, and most of the volunteers are women. So I think there are ways in which we see, you know, the big landscape of female volunteers and activists who are at work to try and make this happen. And there's certainly a correlation there. But in terms of like a kind of a one-to-one result, that's not something that I can answer here today.
Thank you, Michelle. Olivia, you have 1 minute to try, if you can, since you're focused on getting women into elected office in the Republican Party. Do you see a correlation?
Yeah, I'll be quick. I can't really speak to a direct correlation either. I would be hesitant to say women vote for women just because they're women, right? And perhaps that's the Republican in me. But I can speak to the importance of getting more women elected and what that does to other women in the country who are considering running for office. And it's kind of that if you see it, you can be it. We very much saw, you know, the wave of women on the left elected last cycle. And I do think that inspired the surge of women that we see on the right this cycle. And just underscoring the importance of, across the board, more women voting and more women running for office.
Terrific. Thank you so much. And let me just say thank you before we close down to all of our panelists for this really stimulating discussion. And that essentially concludes this program. And aside from thanking the panelists who did a terrific job and the great questions from the audience, I also want to thank the Andrew Mellon Foundation, whose support has made the whole conference and the multi-year exploration of gender and voting rights at Radcliffe possible. So hopefully you'll be able to attend and participate in future Radcliffe programs, including the final session of this virtual conference, which we would have preferred to have in person, but we're very happy to have you here with us virtually, which is Voting Matters, Gender, Citizenship, and the Long 19th Amendment. And that session is the last one. 2020 Visions will be held on December 3rd. Information will come up after we close out. You can also see it at Radcliffe's website. So thank you so much for coming and joining us, and we'll hope you will be able to be here with us again on December 3rd. Thank you.